Some monsters never come to destroy you. Sometimes they come because no one else is left to stand watch. Every evening, just as the last streaks of gold disappeared behind the endless pine trees of Frost Hollow, Evelyn Carter would latch the weathered wooden door of her tiny cottage, pull the faded curtains across the narrow windows, and whisper the same quiet prayer she had spoken for nearly a year. She prayed for another peaceful night, another sunrise, another chance to keep living in a world that had long ago decided she did not belong. The people in the nearby Pack village rarely spoke her name anymore. To most of them, she was simply the forgotten Omega who had chosen to disappear into the forest after endless whispers, endless pity, and endless reminders that someone like her could never matter. She had stopped trying to prove them wrong months ago. Solitude was kinder than judgment. Her little cottage rested nearly 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by towering pines whose branches swayed like silent guardians beneath the moon. During the day, the forest was almost beautiful. Birds filled the crisp mountain air with cheerful songs. Deer wandered carefully through patches of wildflowers, and sunlight painted soft patterns across the worn porch where Evelyn spent her mornings mending blankets and tending the tiny herb garden that somehow survived every harsh season. But everything changed after sunset. The woods became impossibly still. Even the crickets seemed to lose their courage. Then it always came. Heavy footsteps. Slow, measured, powerful enough to send faint vibrations through the wooden floorboards beneath her feet. Evelyn never rushed toward the window anymore. She had made that mistake the first night she heard the sound. Curiosity had pulled back the curtain just enough for her frightened eyes to catch a glimpse of something enormous standing at the edge of the clearing. A wolf unlike anything she had ever imagined. Its fur was darker than the midnight sky, swallowing the pale moonlight instead of reflecting it. Broad shoulders rose higher than the split-rail fence surrounding her cottage, and bright silver eyes watched the little house without moving, without growling, without showing even the smallest sign of aggression. She had frozen in place, certain that she would not live to see morning. But morning had come, and so had another night. Then another. Weeks became months. Every evening, just after darkness settled across the valley, the giant black wolf returned to exactly the same place. It never crossed the fence. It never approached the porch. It simply watched. At dawn, it vanished without leaving anything behind except impossibly large paw prints pressed into the damp earth. Word eventually spread through the nearby village. Hunters claimed a cursed beast had chosen the forest as its territory. Children dared each other to search for its tracks before running home in terror. Merchants refused to travel the old road after sunset, convinced no ordinary animal could reach such impossible size. More than once, kind neighbors begged Evelyn to abandon the cottage forever. She always smiled politely and thanked them for their concern. Somehow, she could never bring herself to leave. The strange thing was that nothing dangerous ever reached her home anymore. Coyotes stopped circling the chicken coop. Bears no longer wandered close to the garden. Even violent storms seemed less frightening when she caught the distant silhouette standing between the trees. She could never explain why, but every time she saw those glowing silver eyes watching from the darkness, her fears slowly gave way to something else. Not trust exactly. Certainly not friendship. Just an unshakable feeling that whatever waited beyond the fence was keeping something far worse away. That evening, the autumn wind carried the scent of fresh rain through the open chimney, while Evelyn placed another log onto the crackling fire. She wrapped an old knitted blanket around her shoulders and glanced toward the window as the familiar footsteps echoed once more through the quiet forest. Right on time. Her heart still skipped, but it no longer raced with panic. Instead, she found herself whispering softly into the empty room, almost embarrassed by the words. "You're back again." Outside, beneath the rising full moon, the enormous black wolf slowly lowered itself onto the cold ground facing the cottage, its silver eyes never leaving the small home glowing warmly among the towering pines, as if guarding a treasure the rest of the world had never learned to see. The first frost arrived 2 weeks earlier than anyone expected, covering the clearing with a silver blanket that sparkled beneath the morning sun. Evelyn Carter stepped carefully onto her porch, pulling her wool sweater tighter against the sharp mountain air. The familiar chill greeted her, but something else immediately caught her attention. A neat stack of freshly cut firewood rested beside the porch steps. She stopped walking. Yesterday that space had been empty. She slowly approached the pile, touching one smooth log with cautious fingers. The wood had been split cleanly, stacked with remarkable care, and was completely dry despite the heavy rain that had fallen through most of the night. She looked toward the endless forest, searching the quiet tree line. There was no sign of another soul. No wagon tracks. No footprints except one enormous set pressed deeply into the damp earth before disappearing into the pines. Evelyn frowned. The nearest village was almost 3 miles away, and no one ever visited without calling her name from the road. She whispered a quiet thank you anyway, feeling slightly foolish as her words drifted into the empty woods. The forest answered only with a gentle breeze. As the days passed, the strange kindnesses continued. Her old water barrel, which usually took nearly an hour to refill from the creek, was somehow full every morning before sunrise. Fallen branches that had blocked the narrow path after a windstorm vanished overnight. Even the small vegetable garden behind the cottage seemed untouched by hungry rabbits that usually destroyed her harvest before autumn arrived. The changes were impossible to ignore. At first, Evelyn convinced herself that fortune had finally decided to smile upon her. Perhaps the moon goddess had not forgotten the lonely Omega after all. Yet every unexplained gift carried the same silent signature. Giant paw prints appeared somewhere nearby before fading into the wilderness with the morning light. One afternoon, she traveled into the village to trade herbs for flour and lamp oil. The familiar conversation stopped as she entered the general store. Curious eyes followed her from one corner of the room to another. Finally, old Mrs. Harper leaned across the counter with genuine concern written across her face. "You still sleep in that cottage every night?" Evelyn nodded politely. "I do." The elderly woman lowered her voice. "Several hunters found tracks bigger than dinner plates near your road yesterday. They say the beast has become bolder. Please come back to the village before winter traps you out there." Evelyn offered a grateful smile. "I appreciate your kindness, but I have managed well so far." She did not tell them that she had begun leaving a small loaf of fresh bread on the porch each evening without knowing why. Every morning it remained untouched, although the snow around it carried those same enormous paw prints circling the house before disappearing once again. Whatever guarded her home never accepted her quiet offering. It simply kept watch. That night a fierce wind swept through Frost Hollow, rattling the shutters hard enough to wake her long before midnight. She wrapped herself in a blanket and moved carefully toward the front window. Outside, snow swirled through the darkness in thick white curtains, making it nearly impossible to see beyond the fence. Then a flash of silver appeared between the falling flakes. The giant wolf stood exactly where it always did, facing the forest instead of the cottage. Its ears remained alert, its powerful frame perfectly still despite the freezing wind. It looked less like a wandering animal and more like a patient sentinel refusing to abandon its post. Evelyn rested her fingertips against the cold glass. For reasons she could not explain, she no longer felt alone during the long winter nights. Somewhere beyond the fence, beneath the endless snowfall, another heartbeat shared the silence with hers, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, and never stepping closer than the promise it seemed determined to keep. Winter settled over Frost Hollow with quiet determination, covering every branch and rooftop beneath layers of white that softened even the oldest scars of the forest. Evelyn Carter had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her unusual life. Every sunrise brought another unexplained blessing, and every sunset carried the familiar promise that somewhere beyond the fence, unseen except for fleeting glimpses beneath the moonlight, the silent guardian would return. She no longer wondered whether the giant wolf would appear. She wondered only if the bitter cold would become too much for even a creature as powerful as that mysterious protector. One afternoon the sky darkened far earlier than usual. Thick gray clouds rolled over the mountains, swallowing the sunlight until the entire valley seemed trapped inside an endless twilight. The wind carried an uneasy silence that made every bird vanish from the trees. Evelyn hurried to gather the last of her herbs from the small garden before the storm arrived. As she reached the porch, a distant sound drifted through the forest. It was not the howl she had occasionally heard echoing across the hills. It was quieter, weaker, almost like someone struggling to breathe through exhaustion. She stood motionless, listening. The sound came again, somewhere beyond the eastern edge of the clearing. Her heart urged caution. Every lesson she had ever learned warned her never to follow unfamiliar noises into the winter woods after dark. Yet another feeling, gentler and impossible to explain, pulled her forward. She wrapped her heavy coat tightly around herself, carried a lantern in one hand, and stepped carefully into the snow. The trail ended only a few hundred yards from the cottage. There, beneath the shelter of an enormous pine tree, she found the giant black wolf lying quietly against the frozen ground. For the first time since she had seen the mysterious creature months ago, it looked vulnerable instead of invincible. Snow rested across its thick, dark fur. Its breathing was slow and uneven. One powerful front leg remained tucked close to its body, as though placing weight upon it required more strength than it could spare. Evelyn remained several feet away, allowing the lantern to cast a warm circle across the snow. The silver eyes she had come to recognize slowly opened and met hers. They were not filled with anger or warning. They carried only exhaustion. The same calm intelligence she had noticed on that very first night remained unchanged. She lowered herself carefully onto one knee. "You have been protecting me all this time," she whispered, almost surprised to hear the words leave her own lips. "Now it is my turn to help you." The enormous wolf did not move. It simply watched her, as though weighing every choice she might make next. Evelyn reached into the satchel hanging across her shoulder and removed a clean cloth along with the small bundle of herbs she always carried whenever she walked into the forest. Her grandmother had taught her which plants eased discomfort, which soothed fever, and which encouraged healing. They were ordinary remedies, nothing more, yet she trusted them because kindness often began with simple things. Moving slowly enough not to frighten the great animal, she knelt beside it. She gently brushed the snow from its dark coat and carefully wrapped the cloth around the strained leg after applying the crushed herbs beneath the bandage. The wolf remained remarkably still. Once or twice it lifted its head slightly, but never once did it pull away from her careful hands. Evelyn smiled softly despite the freezing air. "You are much calmer than the village stories claim," she murmured. "Perhaps they never stayed long enough to know you." A faint gust carried snowflakes between the towering pines, and for one brief moment, she could have sworn the great wolf leaned ever so slightly toward her gentle touch before closing its silver eyes again. Far beyond the clearing, hidden among the dark trees where neither Evelyn nor the silent guardian could see, another pair of unfamiliar footprints slowly appeared in the fresh snow, stopping just long enough to study the cottage before quietly turning back toward the distant village. The following morning the storm had passed, leaving the forest brighter than Evelyn Carter had seen in weeks. Sunlight poured through snow-covered branches, turning every crystal of ice into scattered diamonds across the clearing. She carried a basket filled with fresh water, clean cloth, and another bundle of herbs back to the great pine where she had left the giant wolf the evening before. For a brief moment, she feared it had disappeared forever. Then she noticed the familiar silver eyes watching her from beneath the low branches. The great black wolf remained exactly where she had last seen it, although its posture seemed stronger than before. Relief quietly settled over her heart. "Good morning," she said with a gentle smile that surprised even herself. "I hoped you would still be here." The wolf blinked slowly but made no attempt to leave. Taking that as permission, Evelyn placed the basket on the snow and carefully examined the cloth she had wrapped around its injured leg. The herbs had stayed in place, and the swelling appeared smaller than the night before. She quietly thanked her grandmother for every lesson she had once considered ordinary. Sometimes the simplest knowledge became the greatest gift. As she replaced the bandage with fresh linen, she spoke softly, not because she expected an answer, but because silence no longer felt necessary between them. She told the wolf about the first winter she had spent alone in the cottage after leaving the village. She admitted how frightening every sound had seemed back then and how she had cried herself to sleep more nights than she could remember. The giant wolf listened without moving, its steady gaze never leaving her face. "People think loneliness becomes easier," she whispered while tying the clean cloth into place. "It does not. You simply become better at pretending it does." A cold breeze carried the scent of pine through the clearing. Somewhere above them a pair of blue jays argued noisily before flying deeper into the woods. The ordinary sounds of the forest somehow made the quiet moment feel even more peaceful. Evelyn reached into her basket and removed a small loaf of warm oat bread she had baked before sunrise. Breaking off a piece, she placed it on a flat stone nearby. The wolf lowered its nose, sniffed politely, then looked back at her without touching the food. Evelyn laughed softly. "I suppose you have better taste than I expected." She set the bread aside and instead filled a wooden bowl with fresh water from her canteen. This time the great animal slowly leaned forward and drank, its movements careful but no longer strained. Watching it recover filled her with unexpected happiness. She had spent so much of her life feeling unnecessary that helping another living creature reminded her she still had something worthwhile to offer. The hours slipped by unnoticed. She spoke about the flowers she hoped would bloom after winter, about the little robin that always built a nest beneath her porch roof each spring, and about the dreams she had quietly hidden from everyone else. Sometimes, she admitted while brushing a few loose snowflakes from the wolf's dark fur, "I wonder what it would feel like if someone waited for me instead of forgetting I existed." The silver eyes resting on her seemed unusually bright in the afternoon light, almost as though every word mattered. She smiled again, embarrassed by her own honesty. "Listen to me. I am talking as though you understand every sentence." The wolf tilted its head ever so slightly, and for the first time since they had met, Evelyn could have sworn amusement flickered behind those remarkable eyes. A warm laugh escaped before she could stop it, echoing gently through the snowy clearing. It had been months since laughter had visited the little cottage. Hidden far beyond the ridge overlooking Frost Hollow, a rider guided his horse between the trees and paused long enough to study the faint trail leading toward Evelyn's home. His expression hardened as he noticed the enormous paw prints beside the smaller human footprints. Without another word, he turned his horse toward the village, carrying news that would soon bring far more visitors to the quiet forest than either Evelyn or her silent companion could possibly expect. For the next 3 days, the quiet routine continued as though the forest itself had agreed to protect the fragile peace growing between Evelyn Carter and the mysterious black wolf. Each morning, she carried fresh water, clean bandages, and simple meals to the old pine tree, and each day the great creature appeared noticeably stronger. Its movements became steadier, its breathing easier, and once, as it stood beneath the pale winter sun, Evelyn realized the top of its broad shoulders nearly reached her own height, even while it remained on all 4 legs. It was magnificent in a way that no story from the village had ever described. There was no cruelty in the silver eyes that followed her every movement. There was only patience, quiet intelligence, and something that almost resembled concern whenever she slipped on the icy ground. On the 4th afternoon, she noticed the wolf standing before she reached the clearing. Instead of lying beneath the familiar pine, it slowly walked toward her, stopping several feet away, as if respecting an invisible promise it had made long ago. Evelyn smiled and placed the basket onto the snow. "I think you are feeling much better," she said warmly. "You hardly need me anymore." The wolf lowered its head ever so slightly, almost as though disagreeing with her. She laughed softly and reached into the basket, removing a small brush she normally used on her old winter blankets. "If you are going to keep living outside in all this snow, someone should at least help you look respectable." She hesitated before lifting the brush toward its thick black fur. The giant animal remained perfectly still. Slowly, gently, she brushed away loose snow and tangled patches of winter coat. The dark fur shimmered beneath the afternoon sunlight, softer than she had imagined despite its impressive thickness. The wolf closed its eyes for a brief moment, appearing unexpectedly peaceful beneath her careful hands. Evelyn smiled to herself. "There you are. You have probably not let anyone do that in a very long time." The peaceful moment lasted only seconds before an unfamiliar sound drifted through the trees. Horses. Several of them. Evelyn immediately straightened, listening carefully as voices echoed faintly beyond the ridge leading toward her cottage. Her heart tightened. Visitors almost never came this far into Frost Hollow during winter. The wolf reacted first. Its ears lifted sharply, every trace of calm disappearing as it turned toward the distant sounds. The silver eyes that had looked so gentle only moments earlier became alert with quiet determination. Evelyn followed its gaze. Through the trees, she could just make out several figures riding slowly along the narrow forest trail. At their front rode Damien Holt, one of the younger alphas from the village, a man whose confidence often exceeded his kindness. Even from this distance, she recognized the familiar dark green cloak draped across his shoulders. Behind him traveled 4 other riders, each carefully scanning the snowy woods. Evelyn felt a knot form inside her stomach. She remembered the conversations in the general store, the worried expressions, the stories about the giant beast living near her home. Someone had decided the rumors deserved investigation. "Please," she whispered as she turned toward the wolf. "You need to leave." The great animal did not move. It remained standing between her and the approaching trail, watching the riders draw steadily closer. Evelyn stepped nearer, lowering her voice. "If they see you, they will not understand. They are afraid of what they do not know." The wolf briefly looked toward her before returning its attention to the distant figures. Snow crunched beneath approaching horses. Damien's voice carried through the trees, calm but determined. "The tracks end somewhere near this clearing. Stay alert." Evelyn's pulse quickened. She knew the riders would arrive within minutes. She also knew the giant wolf could disappear into the forest long before anyone reached them if it chose to. Yet instead of retreating, the magnificent creature remained exactly where it stood, its broad frame quietly placing itself between the approaching strangers and the lonely Omega who had never once asked for protection, but had somehow received it every single night. The riders emerged from the trees one after another until 5 horses stood at the edge of the clearing, their breath rising in pale clouds against the winter air. Damien Holt guided his horse forward first, his sharp eyes moving from Evelyn Carter to the enormous black wolf standing several yards away. For a long moment no one spoke. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn stepped instinctively toward the wolf, placing herself between it and the approaching riders before she fully realized what she was doing. Damien slowly climbed down from his saddle, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and suspicion. "Evelyn," he called, keeping his voice calm. "Move away from that creature." She shook her head. "It is not what you think." One of the other men glanced nervously at the giant animal. "That is the beast everyone has been talking about." Another whispered, "It could have harmed her months ago if it wanted to." Damien frowned as he studied the strange scene before him. The wolf did not bare its teeth. It did not growl. It did not even take a single step toward the visitors. Instead, it remained perfectly still, watching every movement with calm silver eyes that seemed almost human in their quiet intelligence. "Evelyn," Damien said again, "we came because we believed you were in danger." She looked back at him, her voice steady despite the fear tightening inside her chest. "I have never been safer." The words surprised everyone, including herself. Damien stared at her as though she had spoken another language. "You cannot possibly trust a wild animal." Evelyn gently rested one hand against the thick black fur beside her. The wolf remained motionless beneath her touch. "For months it has guarded my home without asking for anything. It never crossed my fence. It never frightened me. It kept every predator away. It stayed outside through storms that no living creature should have endured. If it wished me harm, it had countless chances." Quiet uncertainty spread across the small group. The riders exchanged uneasy glances. Nothing they witnessed matched the terrifying stories that had spread through the village. Damien slowly took one cautious step forward. The giant wolf immediately shifted its weight, placing itself slightly farther in front of Evelyn without showing any sign of aggression. The movement was simple, almost effortless, yet unmistakably protective. Damien stopped walking. "It is guarding you," one of the riders murmured in amazement. Before anyone could speak again, a distant howl echoed across the snowy mountains. The giant wolf lifted its head, listening carefully. Its silver eyes narrowed as though hearing something no human could understand. A cold breeze swept across the clearing, stirring the branches overhead. Then something extraordinary happened. The air itself seemed to shimmer around the great black wolf. Soft streams of silver light rose from the snow like drifting moonbeams, wrapping gently around its massive form. Evelyn instinctively stepped backward, unable to look away. The riders stood frozen in complete silence. The glowing light grew brighter but never harsh, illuminating the quiet clearing with the gentle radiance of a winter moon. The enormous silhouette slowly changed before their eyes. Broad shoulders became those of a man. Powerful paws gave way to steady feet upon the snow. Dark fur dissolved into a long black cloak that settled naturally around a tall figure standing exactly where the wolf had been only moments before. When the light finally faded, a man remained. He was taller than anyone Evelyn had ever seen, with dark hair touched by the pale glow of winter sunlight and striking silver eyes that were impossible to mistake. They were the same eyes that had watched over her cottage every night beneath the moon. Absolute silence filled the clearing. Damien's face lost every trace of confidence as recognition slowly overtook disbelief. Without speaking a single word, he lowered his head. One by one, the other riders did the same. Evelyn looked from the kneeling men to the stranger standing quietly before her, her heart racing with confusion as he met her gaze with the same calm warmth she had come to trust beneath the shadow of black fur. Finally, Damien spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your Majesty." Alpha King Cale Ashford. No one moved for what felt like an eternity. Snowflakes drifted quietly through the clearing, settling upon the shoulders of the kneeling riders while the winter wind carried away the last traces of shimmering light. Evelyn Carter could not make sense of what stood before her. Every memory of the silent guardian outside her cottage suddenly returned with overwhelming clarity. The silver eyes watching from the darkness. The carefully stacked firewood. The fresh water waiting every morning. The quiet presence beyond the fence through storms and lonely nights. Every impossible kindness now belonged to one man. Alpha King Cale Ashford took one slow step toward her, careful to leave enough distance that she would not feel cornered. His expression held neither pride nor expectation. It carried only quiet sincerity. "I owe you the truth," he said, his deep voice calm enough to soften the frozen air around them. Evelyn searched his face, still struggling to connect the gentle guardian she had come to trust with the legendary ruler whose name inspired respect across every pack. "You were there," she whispered. "Every single night." Cale nodded once. "Yes." "For how long?" His silver eyes never left hers. "Since the first snowfall last year." Her breath caught. Nearly an entire year. Every lonely evening she had believed herself forgotten. Someone had chosen to remain outside her home instead of inside the warmth of a palace. She looked down for a moment, remembering every quiet conversation she had shared with the great wolf, every fear she had confessed beneath the old pine tree, every dream she had spoken aloud because she believed no human ears could hear her. Heat rose gently across her cheeks. "You heard everything," she murmured. A faint smile touched Cale's face. "I did." She covered her face for a brief second before letting out an embarrassed laugh. "That is almost unfair." Even Damien Holt glanced up in surprise. It was the first time anyone present had heard the Alpha King smile. Cale's expression softened even further. "You never pretended to be someone else. That is rarer than strength." Evelyn lowered her hands and looked back at him. "Why me?" The question carried every uncertainty she had buried inside herself for years. "There are countless people across your kingdom. Why would the Alpha King spend his nights guarding an Omega everyone else overlooked?" Cale remained silent for several seconds before answering. "1 year ago, I traveled these lands alone after hearing reports that rogue predators had crossed the northern border. I passed your cottage just before midnight." His gaze drifted briefly toward the little home visible through the trees. "You did not know I was there. A frightened deer had become trapped beneath a fallen branch after a storm. You walked outside carrying only a lantern. Instead of turning away, you spent nearly an hour freeing the animal with your bare hands, even though the temperature was well below freezing." Evelyn barely remembered the moment. To her, it had been nothing extraordinary. Anyone would have helped. Cale gently shook his head. "No, many would have walked past because no one else was watching." His voice remained steady, but every word carried quiet conviction. "You believed you were alone, yet you still chose kindness. That is when I realized the stories about the forgotten Omega had never told the truth." Evelyn's eyes slowly filled with emotion she could not quite explain. She had spent years believing her small acts of compassion disappeared unnoticed into the world. She had never imagined someone had been watching from the shadows, remembering every one of them. Cale continued softly. "I stayed because each night confirmed what I saw that evening. You greeted every sunrise with gratitude despite having so little. You offered bread to a creature everyone feared. You cared for me when you believed I was only a wounded animal. You never once asked what I could give you in return. The clearing fell silent once more. Even the riders remained perfectly still, listening to words they never expected to hear from their king. Kale met Evelyn's gaze with the same quiet warmth she had trusted for months beneath silver eyes hidden within black fur. The kingdom knows me as its Alpha King, he said. But before you knew my name, you simply chose to be kind. I will never forget that. The journey back to the village began beneath a sky washed with pale winter sunlight, yet nothing about that afternoon felt ordinary anymore. Damien Holt and the other riders remained respectfully behind Alpha King Cale Ashford and Evelyn Carter, speaking only in quiet whispers whenever they believed the king could not hear them. Word traveled faster than horses through the northern territories, and before they reached the village square, people had already begun gathering outside their homes. Men, women, and children stood shoulder to shoulder, watching with wide eyes as the royal party approached. Many recognized the Alpha King immediately. Many recognized Evelyn as well. The forgotten Omega who had quietly disappeared into the forest now walked beside the ruler of every northern pack. Confusion spread across countless faces. Mrs. Harper covered her mouth with trembling hands. Several elders exchanged uncertain glances. Others lowered their heads respectfully as Cale entered the square. Evelyn suddenly became painfully aware of every curious eye following her. Instinctively, she slowed her steps, but Cale noticed immediately. Without speaking, he matched her pace, making certain she never felt left behind. The simple gesture did not go unnoticed. Damien stepped forward and addressed the gathering with careful respect. His Majesty wishes to speak. Silence settled across the square. Cale looked slowly around the crowd, his calm silver eyes meeting the faces of people who had long believed they understood the young woman standing beside him. 1 year ago, he began, many of you believed Evelyn Carter had nothing left to offer your community. No one interrupted. You measured her value by her rank, by rumors, and by what she lacked instead of what she quietly gave every day. Several villagers lowered their eyes. Cale continued with the same calm voice. I watched her when no one else did. I watched her help injured animals without expecting praise. I watched her share food she could barely spare. I watched her greet strangers with kindness even after experiencing loneliness that would have hardened many hearts. Mrs. Harper wiped away a quiet tear. She remembered every small act she had once overlooked. Cale turned toward Evelyn before speaking again. The strongest foundation of any kingdom is not built by power alone. It is built by compassion, honesty, and quiet courage. Those qualities cannot always be seen from a throne, but they reveal themselves in moments when no one believes they are being watched. Evelyn looked down, overwhelmed by emotions she had never imagined feeling before an entire village. She had spent years hoping only to be accepted. She had never dreamed of being defended. A young boy stepped shyly out from the crowd, holding a small wooden carving Evelyn had once repaired after it broke during the previous spring festival. Miss Carter fixed this for me, he said softly. She would not take any money. An elderly farmer nodded. She gathered herbs for my wife when she was ill. Another woman smiled through tears. She left baskets of vegetables on my porch after the harvest failed, but she never told anyone. One memory after another quietly surfaced until the square filled with stories that had remained unnoticed for years. Evelyn listened in stunned silence. She had forgotten many of those moments herself because helping people had never felt extraordinary. Cale allowed every voice to be heard before speaking one final time. Kindness often works in silence. That is why the world sometimes fails to recognize it until much later. He turned fully toward Evelyn, his expression carrying the same quiet warmth she had first seen reflected in silver eyes beneath the moonlit forest. I recognized it. The village remained completely still. There was no grand proclamation, no dramatic command, and no display of authority. Cale simply offered Evelyn his hand with quiet respect, giving her the choice that he had protected all along. For a brief moment, she looked at the familiar hand, remembering the great black wolf that had stood faithfully outside her cottage through snow, storms, and lonely nights. Then, with a gentle smile that reached her eyes, Evelyn placed her hand in his, and throughout the silent village no one saw an Alpha King standing above an Omega. They saw two souls who had first found one another through simple acts of kindness, long before either of them spoke a single true name. Spring arrived quietly in Frost Hollow, melting the last traces of snow until the streams once again sang through the forest and wildflowers returned to the little clearing where Evelyn Carter had spent so many lonely mornings. Although the royal carriage now waited whenever she wished to travel to the capital, she asked for one final visit before leaving the cottage behind. Cale Ashford agreed without hesitation. He understood that some places were more than homes. They were chapters of the heart that deserved a proper farewell. Together they walked the familiar path beneath towering pines, passing the old garden where tiny green shoots were beginning to push through the soil. The porch looked exactly as Evelyn remembered it, weathered by countless seasons yet still welcoming beneath the afternoon sun. She rested one hand against the wooden railing and smiled softly. "I thought I would never leave this place," she admitted. Cale looked around the peaceful clearing. This cottage sheltered someone who never allowed hardship to change her heart. It deserves to be remembered. Evelyn stepped inside one last time. The little fireplace still stood where she had spent endless winter evenings reading old books and whispering hopes into the silence. The worn chair beside the window remained exactly where she had watched moonlight spill across the clearing. Every corner carried memories that no palace could replace. She closed the door gently behind her and turned toward Cale. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the palace. Not for the crown. Thank you for making sure I always saw another sunrise." Cale smiled with quiet warmth. "You gave me something far greater." She tilted her head curiously. "What could I possibly have given the Alpha King?" He glanced toward the forest beyond the fence. "A reason to stop carrying every burden alone." They stood together in comfortable silence until the evening sky slowly turned shades of gold and lavender. As the first stars appeared overhead, Cale stepped away from the porch and walked into the center of the clearing. Gentle silver light surrounded him once more, soft as moonlight resting upon fresh water. Moments later, the enormous black wolf stood where the Alpha King had been only seconds before. Evelyn smiled through grateful tears that never quite fell. The magnificent creature walked slowly to the exact place where it had kept watch through countless nights. It lowered itself onto the ground, facing the cottage with the same quiet patience it had shown from the very beginning. Evelyn crossed the clearing and rested both hands against the thick black fur that had once frightened her simply because she had not yet understood it. "You really stayed here every night?" she whispered. The great wolf lifted its silver eyes to meet hers, calm and familiar as always. She laughed softly. "I spent so many months wondering why I never felt completely alone." The wolf leaned gently into her touch, and for the first time she understood that true strength had never announced itself with loud words or grand displays. It had waited quietly beyond her fence, asking for nothing except the chance to protect someone who believed she had been forgotten. When the moon finally rose above the pines, Cale returned to his human form beside her. Together they looked once more at the little cottage glowing beneath the silver light. It would remain standing exactly where it had always been, not as a reminder of loneliness, but as the place where compassion had changed two lives forever. As they walked toward the waiting carriage, Evelyn glanced back one final time. The breeze carried the scent of pine through the clearing, and for just a moment she imagined she could still see the outline of a giant black wolf watching peacefully beside the old fence. She smiled because she knew some promises never truly ended. They simply became part of the people who carried them forward. Long after the carriage disappeared beyond the trees, travelers passing through Frost Hollow would still speak of the quiet cottage where no darkness ever crossed the fence, and where the greatest king in the Northern Territories had once chosen, night after night, to guard the heart of an ordinary Omega until she finally understood that she had never been forgotten at all.